Lead the narrative. I'm your host, J Loren Norris, and I really want you to understand that everything in your life is a narrative. Every decision you make, there's a narrative behind it. Every purchase that you make, every place that you go, every person you hang out with, it's a narrative. And you have a choice in life. You can lead the narrative or you can be led by it. Today we have in studio with us a couple of thespians who are literally impacting the world. Maybe only 25, 35, 55 people at a time, but deeply ingrained in a conversation that looks like a very innocuous play. And so I want you to meet some friends today, Brian Clowdus and Jen Maroney. And I really appreciate you guys being here today. Thanks for stopping by the studio. It's been really cool just to have a chance to experience what you do.
Thanks for having us.
So tell me a little bit, Brian, how in the world did you decide that using the world of theater was a good way to reach a community? Is this purely a profit drive, or is there something more behind it?
So I've performed my entire life. I grew up in church. My granny played the piano. So music and performance was something that was, from the second I could walk, was something I did, and realized very early on that performing and singing was a gift I had. And you know, I was lucky that my granny had this musical gift as well. So I was raised singing in church, and I always said my first tour was the revival circuit. You know, I grew up in Alabama in the country. So we grew up going to tent revivals, you know, and my granny played the piano. And I fell in love with performance and the ability to impact lots of people through storytelling and through songs. So I was an actor for the first part of my life. Then I began directing and producing about 15 years ago. And as an actor, I was always one of those actors who saw the whole picture. So for me, I always wanted to tell the whole story. And as a director and producer, you get to tell the entire story. And when I began producing, you know, I don't come from money. You know, I come from a very meager background, but, you know, I was always very thrifty and resourceful. And, you know, theater and entertainment's a very expensive industry. And so, you know, I didn't have a theater, you know, and I said, well, let's just try it outdoors. You know, theater began outdoors. So I started doing things outside out of necessity. And that quickly became my thing, doing theater in different locations, not having to build the set, choosing locations that already had the set there. And then that is what differentiated me. You know, I became this site-specific outdoor theater producer, and it wasn't my goal. I just started out of necessity because I didn't have an indoor theater space. And then very quickly I realized that thing was what set me apart from what everyone else was doing. And here we are in Granbury, you know, having just opened Charlotte's Web in a really incredible outdoor farm space. So.
And I love it. I can tell you, I did theater when I was in high school, choir from middle school all the way up, did a little bit of it after that, but you know, nothing to the scale of what you're doing. What really fascinates me though is seeing, like you said, taking it from inside the theater where we're building sets and, you know, trying to get the lights right and trying to get the angles right and trying to get people in the right place and trying to block them right, to moving into an outdoor space where the audience is basically part of the show. And so like when Jen came up and you could hear her over the mic singing her song from a distance and you're like, where is she? I know she's around here somewhere, but I can't see her. And then she burst onto the scene. And even the wardrobe depicted the character, the behavior, the blocking, the movement depicted the character in a way that I don't think I've ever seen Charlotte's Web portrayed. Jen, what was that like for you the first time you saw the script and thought, okay, so it's a lot of singing and it's also a whole different persona than maybe I've ever played in a role before?
Yeah, it actually made me really excited to have the opportunity to play Charlotte. So I got to hear a little bit about Brian's vision for the character, and I just thought it was so interesting. Charlotte is really such a complex character. She starts to show off, and she's this famous movie star-esque person, and she's also very selfish. So in my mind, Charlotte's lived her entire life for herself. She's lived for fame and for attention, and when she comes to the farm and she meets Wilbur, she finally gets to know someone who loves her for her, that she doesn't have to impress. And so it begins to change her heart. It begins to teach her how to love and how to be selfless. And that's really the miracle of the show.
Well, and I think it was pretty fascinating too, the way it was portrayed, when you came into the circle of the farm environment and everybody turned their back on you. And for a moment you forget that this, celebrity-esque person is a black widow. Most people don't want to hang out with those so much anyway, right? And so it wasn't just the untouchable that I'm an elitist, I'm a little bit better than you, but there are other reasons to be untouchable, so to speak. And so that portrayal was, I think, was very well done. But then Wilbur was the first one to be like, I'm not sure, and I don't know how much of this is scripted or written in, or how much you had to coach your young actor to reach the hand and then draw it back. But the moment of that, it happened about 2 feet from my table. So it was, I was really caught with that moment to say, okay, well, does he know something the rest of us don't know, or is he about to learn something that he doesn't know and the rest of us are well aware of? So how did that fit between the script and the impromptu, if you will, of the characters interacting?
Yeah, so, a lot of that is just what we create within our vision, so we're using a script, it's the standard Charlotte's Web script, but all of this is something that we just conceptualize. So we're using the text that we're given, but this whole idea of Charlotte being this 1940s sort of glamazon, and this idea of, Wilbur reaching out to her and then kind of connecting. They're both strangers, he's new to the farm, and this idea of perhaps she's someone returning to this farm. I really wanted to give them a reason to need each other, and I think that we're all strangers, right? And we're all hungry for that human connection. But what I love doing is I love taking a script and I say we're going to ignore all the stage directions, right? What we are going to honor is the text. We're given that text, but as a director and a company, we get to take those lines and put them in a new concept and a new vision and a new setting. And in these shows, where you're playing animals, I think we've all seen kind of that like cheesy, children's theater where you're in those like animal costumes. I wanted to make these animals as human as possible and give them animal characteristics, because I think once we see these animals as beings and we humanize them, we're more connected to them. I mean, it was so crazy. Last night, I saw this little spider, and I was like, I'm not going to kill that spider. You know what I mean? So, in my Airbnb I'm staying at, I went and got a cup, and I was like, what if it's Charlotte? So here I am, like, scooping up this, dangerous spider, just because you start to think of things differently when you give them those human aspects. And probably you saw in Charlotte, she has the spider rhinestone necklace and earrings, and she's dressed in all black, but I wanted them to feel human and just have these animal characteristics.
And how do you feel playing a spider?
It's so much fun. I also saw a spider yesterday and did not kill it. That's hilarious.
Isn't that crazy? It's so like
funny.
You really think of them differently. Now you're like, oh, bless their heart. Let me scoop up this little
In fact,
spider.
I was like, let me watch this spider and see how it moves.
Exactly.
It was research. It was great. No, I love playing Charlotte. She's such a fun, dynamic character, and I love her heart change at the end. I'm a mother myself. I have a son who's about Wilbur's age. And so it's really fun to see her transform into a nurturing, kind of maternal personality at the end.
Well, and she's transforming because she's actually becoming a mother. So all those symptoms of nesting, we have 4 and 10 that call us Lolly and Poppy. And so that the relationship you begin to have with each of their unique little personalities. Now, I can't imagine raising, was it 514? That idea of family, though, it begins to change who you are because you take on a new level of responsibility, a new persona. I shared a video on LinkedIn this morning of a guy who's driving and gets pulled over in his classic Mercedes, and his, I would guess, nephew or son is with him, and they're people of color. And so immediately the son pulls his cell phone out. He wants to, record this whole incident. The cop starts acting like a jerk because they're acting like a jerk to each other. And the driver of the car is an older, wiser guy. He just kind of handles the whole thing really calmly. And then the officer gets hit by a scooter and they have to take him to the hospital. And it turns out the driver of the car is the heart surgeon that saves his life.
Wow.
And the kid later asks him, he's like, why would you save the man's life? He's going to go out there and be a racist and be a jerk again to somebody else. He said, my decision isn't about him. It's about who I am. Mm-hmm. And so when I say lead the narrative, what I mean by lead the narrative is understanding that the story going on in your head about being a mom, about interacting with nature, with other people, with our environment, with creatures and critters all over the world. We have to be responsible for this story that we tell in our head. Is it a spider that I'm going to put in a cup and take it outside, or am I going to squash it because it could kill me in my sleep? That's a decision we have to make, but it's a story that we're telling ourselves in our head. I'm really curious though, because I noticed, and it's kind of the propensity that I lean to, a lot of the music within Charlotte's Web was very faith-based. Almost every song was an old spiritual gospel song. I don't know if that was in the original script that way or not, but it really stood out here in Granbury, in the heart of the Bible Belt, so to speak. I'm curious though, how do you plan to pull off Edgar Allan Poe?
Edgar Allan Poe will be very different than Charlotte's Web. Our goal is to hit as many sectors of the audience as possible. We have never done a family daytime production, so this was new for us for Granbury. We really wanted to hit, kids. And also, I grew up with Charlotte's Web, so for me, it's nostalgic, So we're seeing a lot of adults who grew up with Charlotte's Web, and then we're seeing a lot of kids who may not know Charlotte's Web. So it's really cool to see it introduced to young children as well. And for me, incorporating some of that pre-show music and the vibe of, spirituality, for me, it was really in the script, and it's interesting. I've read a lot about, E.B. White's spirituality. This is really a story about life and death and how we teach children that there is something, after this life. And, Charlotte really clings to her spirituality and kind of rediscovers it through this production. So, I want to inspire people without being heavy-handed, that there is something after this life, and, to get people curious. My whole goal is to get audience members curious, asking questions, and having conversation. I'm not a fan of browbeating people or, having an agenda with theater. I think we see a lot of that these days. I really want to get back to theater and entertainment being for everyone, not just, one side of the aisle politically. I really want theater to be for everyone. When it comes to Edgar Allan Poe, it's going to be very different. It's going to be a little bit more adult. But it's not going to be so adult that your kids can't come to. We get a lot of questions like that, like, is it going to be appropriate for kids? There's no adult content, but it will be spooky, So I say if your kids are terrified of the dark, you probably don't want to bring them, But my niece and nephews, they're in that like 11 to 13 age. They love all things creepy, Yeah. And really, it's about also celebrating literature. Charlotte's Web, famous piece of literature. Edgar Allan Poe, perhaps one of the most famous Gothic writers ever. So we really want to celebrate the life of Edgar Allan Poe and his most iconic stories. So we're going to weave in The Raven, The Mask of Red Death, The Fall of the House of Usher, and Telltale Heart. And it basically chronicles the last few days of Edgar Allan Poe's life and how he died alone, which is kind of crazy. He, of course, had addictions that he struggled with his entire life, but this whole concept is you're entering into his final days and all he has are his stories. So he basically is comforted by all of his most famous stories, and you basically see him pass,
Well, it's amazing when you think back at literature, whether it's Ralph Waldo Emerson or it's C.S. Lewis or so many of these writers and poets, they live in a different world, so to speak, inside their own head, inside their own heart. Their message of the world is completely different than what everybody else sees. It is kind of its own narrative. I'll give you a challenge if you get bored one day. There's a collection, it's a book I have, in fact, on the shelf behind me called The Aristocrat at the Table.
Oh, cool.
And one of the things that was fascinating about it, you talk about going back in time, and great literature is representative of the time that it's written in, almost like a great history lesson, but it unfolds so many things for us. So in An Aristocrat at the Table, one of the things he talks about is, and I believe he was a Supreme Court justice, but he talks about having the man of the house who was a man of color, and his only job was to never leave the owner without an answer. His job was to be the most educated man in town. Now, in a time when men of color were not allowed to be educated unless they held this role. And there was a particular name for that role. And so if you think back to our days growing up, it was Benson, right? With the what was the name of that show with the little, Benson was the butler, and then there was the little tiny midget guy. I'll think of it later. Anyway, the whole concept was he had a specific space, and in that space he could be supremely intelligent, very well educated, very well articulated, but outside that space, silent. Which was kind of an amazing thing to me. But when you look back at our history books and our literature, people are like, well, I don't really care to read novels. You're like, but some of what they read, Orwell, maybe was advanced fiction way ahead of its time, and other is depicting of the time that we live in. So tell me a little bit, as you contrast the roles, the characters, how do you allow yourself to step back to a 1940s performance, for an example, and say, I'm going to be this person that I've never met, I've only read about, I've got to get into the character, part of it's going to be in the text, and part of it's going to be, I assume, some research that you did on who that would be and how you would portray them?
Of course, yes. I watched several movies, so I watched Gone with the Wind, just because Vivian Lee?
Vivian Lee,
Vivian Lee, yeah, she's, I thought so. She's just such a dynamic character, and she has this presence about her. So that was some research. So several movies from other 1940s era movies to kind of get that persona. And then also some of that is my own maternal journey, so some of that comes from that. But then also, like, the 1940s were such a more simple time, and relationships were at the forefront. They didn't have as many distractions as we have now. And
Right.
so Charlotte's Web is all about relationships and interactions with each other and what we can learn from each other. And no matter how different we are, we always have something in common, and it's friendship or love. So that was a journey for me.
And it's breaking down cultural barriers and emotional barriers. And Animal Farm is a book about animals, but in an entirely different way. And they literally depict certain personality types, character types, professions, et cetera, et cetera.